I had spent years chasing killers, but nothing could have prepared me for Texarkana. The spring of 1946 turned this sleepy border town into a hunting ground. His hunting ground. They called him the Phantom Killer, and I had come to know his work intimately. But something about these murders, something that twisted my gut, told me this was no ordinary case. The first attack was brutal. A young couple found slaughtered on the outskirts of town, their bodies left mutilated in a way that felt wrong. Not just wrong, but evil. The boy, barely 20, had his head bashed in with something heavy, something blunt. But it was the girl's body that haunted my dreams. She had been stabbed multiple times, the knife wounds almost ritualistic in nature, each one deliberate, precise. And that mask he left behind, a grotesque sack, torn and dirty, was worse than any bloody detail at the crime scene. It felt like a signature, a warning. Texarkana was a town that prided itself on peace and quiet. But now it trembled. Fear gripped every corner. Every shadow felt longer, and every creak of an old house made people jump out of their skin. Parents kept their children inside, and lovers no longer risked moonlit drives along Lover's Lane. But despite the curfew and the increased patrols, the Phantom struck again and again. He was relentless, always one step ahead, leaving no trace. No fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing but dead bodies and that damn mask. As the lead detective, I buried myself in the case, poring over every piece of evidence, every dead end. But there was something deeper, something I couldn't shake. I began hearing whispers, stories from the old folks in town, stories about dark things that lurked in the woods. They spoke of rituals, ancient practices that had been long forgotten, things the younger generation scoffed at. But the elders remembered. The Phantom Killer wasn't just a man, they said. He was something more. And if I wasn't careful, I'd find out exactly what. Late one night, I was working alone at the station. My partner, Bill, had gone home hours ago, and the rest of the team had scattered, trying to make sense of the few leads we had. But I couldn't let it go. I had to know. I was staring at the latest crime scene photos when I heard it. A faint whisper. So soft that at first, I thought it was the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Detective." I froze. My hand instinctively reached for my gun. The station was empty, or at least it was supposed to be. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Silence. But the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stood up slowly, gun drawn, and walked toward the back of the room, where the filing cabinets loomed like silent sentinels. The shadows felt thicker back there, darker than they should have been. As I approached, I heard it again, whispers, but this time they were accompanied by a soft scraping sound like nails on a chalkboard. I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing, no one, just the empty room and the echo of my own ragged breath. I wanted to chalk it up to exhaustion, to stress, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. And then I saw it, on my desk. The case file I had been working on was open, but the pages had been shuffled. The photos of the victims, once neatly arranged, were now scattered across the desk. And there, in the center, was something that hadn't been there before. A mask. It was the same one. The same torn, dirty sack that the Phantom had left at the scene of his first murder. But this one was different. This one had eyes. Not real eyes, but two dark holes that seemed to follow me as I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "Detective." The whisper was louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the shadows shifted, growing, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as I tried to get away, but the mask, it moved. It slid off the desk, its empty eye holes fixed on me, and I could swear I saw something, someone, beneath it. A face, twisted and deformed, grinning at me from the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The room was quiet again, the temperature back to normal, but the mask, it was gone. The photos were back in place, neatly stacked as if nothing had ever happened. I sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I didn't know. All I knew was that this case was far from over. The Phantom Killer wasn't just a man. He was something worse, something I couldn't understand. And if I didn't find him soon, I was afraid he would find me first. But deep down, I knew the truth. He already had. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The events at the station had rattled me to my core. I kept seeing that mask, that twisted face beneath it, grinning at me as if it knew something I didn't. And those whispers, those godforsaken whispers, they still echoed in my mind. I had chased killers before, but this was something else, something far darker. By dawn, I was back at the station, bleary-eyed and on edge. Bill was already there, sipping his usual cup of black coffee, looking at me with concern. "You look like hell," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell him everything about the mask, the whispers, the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. But how could I explain it? How could I make him understand that this case had spiraled into something far beyond what we were trained for? "Yeah," I lied, "just a rough night." Bill didn't push it. He just nodded and handed me a file. "Got a lead. Witness says they saw someone near the old Johnson barn last night, around the time of the last murder. Could be nothing, but it's the best we've got." The Johnson barn. It was an abandoned structure on the outskirts of town, a relic of a family long gone. The place had a reputation. Locals said it was haunted, cursed even. Kids dared each other to go there at night, but most were too scared to venture too close. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, that this was where everything would come to a head. Bill and I drove out to the barn in silence. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the landscape. As we approached, the wind picked up, whipping through the tall grass, making the old wooden boards of the barn creak and groan like a living thing. The place felt wrong, like the ground itself was tainted. We parked a few yards away, the gravel crunching under our boots as we stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and as we approached the barn, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door was ajar, and there, hanging from a rusty nail, was the mask. The same mask I had seen at the station. The same mask the Phantom Killer had left at the scenes of his murders. But this time, it wasn't just hanging there. It was watching us. I could feel its gaze, feel the darkness that radiated from it like a poison. Bill saw it too. "What the hell?" he muttered, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "You seeing this?" I nodded, my throat dry. We moved cautiously, weapons drawn, and stepped into the barn. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something else, something metallic, blood. It was everywhere. Fresh streaks smeared across the wooden beams, pools of it soaking into the dirt floor. And in the center of it all, standing perfectly still, was a figure. The Phantom. He wore the mask, his body draped in tattered clothing, stained with blood. But as I looked closer, I realized something was horribly wrong. His body, it wasn't right. His limbs were twisted, elongated, his skin pale and stretched tight over bones that didn't seem human. And then he turned to face us. I froze. This wasn't a man. It couldn't be. His eyes, deep within the dark holes of the mask, glowed with an unnatural light, a light that seemed to pulse, drawing me in, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Bill fired first, the gunshot echoing through the barn like a thunderclap. The Phantom staggered back, but he didn't fall. He didn't bleed. Instead, he let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I fired next, emptying my clip into him, but it was useless. The bullets hit, but they didn't stop him. He just kept coming, that twisted grin visible beneath the mask, his eyes burning brighter with each step. Bill screamed as the Phantom reached him, a long, gnarled hand wrapping around his throat. I tried to move, tried to help him, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I watched in horror as Bill's body convulsed, his face turning blue as the life was choked out of him. And then, with a sickening crack, it was over. Bill's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide open in terror. The Phantom turned to me then, and I knew this was the end. But instead of attacking, he spoke. His voice was a raspy whisper, like dead leaves scraping against the ground. "It's done," he said. "The ritual is complete." I didn't understand. None of this made sense. But as he spoke, the air around us began to change. The temperature plummeted, and I could feel a presence, a dark, malevolent force descending upon the barn. "Texarkana is mine now," the phantom whispered, his voice filled with a twisted satisfaction. "The town, the people, they belong to me." And then, just like that, he was gone. The barn was empty, the bloodstains vanished, and Bill's body, it was nowhere to be found. I stood there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. I would never be able to. The Phantom Killer was real, but he wasn't a man. He was something far worse, something ancient, something evil, and he had claimed Texarkana for his own. I left the barn that day, but the darkness followed me. The town never recovered. The killing stopped, but the fear, the terror, remained. People whispered about the detective who went mad, who claimed the Phantom was a demon, a creature from another world. But they didn't know the truth. They couldn't understand. I've tried to move on, but I can't. Every night I hear the whispers, feel the cold, see that mask in the corner of my room watching, waiting. I know he's still out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows, biding his time. And I know one day he'll come for me.